Good morning. I'm Ava Loy Lanning, Executive Director of NewStory Center, and welcome to Coffee and Conversation Recognizing Sexual Awareness Month. I am here with an amazing group of people, and first want to tell you a little bit about NewStory Center. We are the domestic and sexual violence service provider for Rutland County. We also serve survivors of human trafficking, and we have an amazing team of advocates that are available to assist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I believe our crisis line is on your screen. It's 802-775-3232. And you can call that number anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you'll get to speak with an advocate. So I'm so thrilled this morning to have this amazing group of people here with us to recognize Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And the reason we're doing that is that our community is not immune to any of the problems that face any community in our country, in our world. And we do have victims and survivors of sexual assault in our community. It's a very underreported crime, and it still has a lot of stigma attached to it. And I want the people listening to know that it is not something to be ashamed of. If you have experienced sexual assault, if you are still experiencing the trauma of sexual assault and you've never talked with anyone about that, our community is here to listen and to help you through that. It is an issue that affects everyone, more women and girls, but men are also victims of sexual assault. Our transgender community is very vulnerable to sexual assault, and the impacts of sexual assault can be lifelong. We know that people who have experienced sexual assault are more apt to experience depression in their life. People who have experienced sexual assault are more apt to turn to substances. And we know that that's true for many people who have experienced trauma. So this is not just a problem that affects one individual, it affects our entire community in so very many ways. And so that's why we have this panel of wonderful people from our community, because we are a community that works together, that's here to support you. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, and then let them talk to you, because they are the experts and they're the ones that we are here to hear from today. So next to me is Ian Sullivan, and this is the first time I've gotten to introduce Ian Sullivan as our Rutland County State's Attorney. So congratulations on that, Ian. And we are so happy to have Ian here. And I first came to know Ian as the attorney at the State's Attorney's Office that was most often doing the DV cases in court, and we got to know Ian that way. And we also asked him to take a red shoe photo and put his foot on some law books that was not at all comfortable for him. And but I'm thrilled to have Ian here. Ian makes his home in Pittsfield with his spouse, his wife, and the two cutest girls you have ever seen. And so I'm thrilled to have you here this morning, Ian. Next to Ian is Heather Baker, who is an RN at Rutland Regional Medical Center, and she is also, I will actually say this, we speak so much in acronyms. She is a SANE A and a SANE P, and what that means is she is a sexual assault nurse examiner for both adults and pediatric sexual assaults. And we work so closely with the SANE nurses at the hospital, and we are so grateful to them for their care, their compassion, their empathy, their expertise, and their partnership. And so I'm thrilled to have Heather with us this morning. Next to Heather is Detective Amber Houle, and from the Rutland City Police Department. She also works special investigations with the Child First Advocacy Center. And Amber has a master's degree in forensic psychology. She's been a police officer for over 5 years. And again, our partnership with the police department is one that we value in our office so much, and with all the police departments around our area and community. We couldn't do this, we couldn't do our work without them and without your thoughtfulness, again, and empathy and compassion and understanding of this issue. That it may, you know, you may meet a survivor or a victim that doesn't fit what the movies show a victim to look like. And your expertise in being able to recognize that is huge and so valuable to the people we all serve. So thank you. And then on the end is Jess Ellis. Jess is the program director for NewStory Center. And I'm going to read something that's in her bio. That Jess said that she loves giving back to her community and is dedicated to showing people that there is still good in the world. And let me just say that Jess is the good that's in the world. Jess makes us smile every day. She's amazing at her work. And if you need us, Jess is one of the advocates that you will talk to. And I couldn't be more grateful on a personal level than to get to work with Jess every day. So my first question to you all, and it's for everyone, is what brought you to the work that you do? We'll start with Ian. I'll put Ian in the hot seat.
Probably not surprisingly for a person who's drawn to working in the law. I was kind of a nerdy kid, loved ideas of the rule of law and how justice works on a conceptual level. While in college, a good friend of mine was the victim of a really severe hit and run. She was lucky to survive it. And as she was recovering from the physical injury she experienced, there was also a justice process that was playing out involving the driver who hit her. At that point, I was in college, was not trained in the law, but I saw the frustration, the confusion that she experienced while she was a victim of crime and really just grappling with what had happened to her and what the response from society would be. I think the prosecutors in that case tried to explain what was going on, but to me it felt like they could do better, and that maybe with some education and some practice, I could fill a role where people wouldn't feel quite so confused and quite so lost in the system. So that is an experience that I come back to time and time again when I think about how we interact with victims and how we can not only pursue justice in the courtroom, but more holistically for the entire community.
Thank you, Ian. Heather, what brings you to this work?
Well, I started as a nurse at Rutland Regional, and then I started in the emergency department. And one day I was walking down the hall, and one of my mentors was going in to do a SANE exam. So I asked her what it was, and you touched briefly about it when you're in nursing school. So she explained what it was, and then I said I would be interested in doing it. So they sent me through the training and everything. The reason I wanted to do it was because I saw how compassionate this other nurse was and how at ease the patient was at the time. She was the one positive thing in this person's life in such a terrible moment. And you know, the exams are invasive, and they take up to 6 hours sometimes, depending on, you know, the patient wants to stop, they want to talk to you, anything like that. But I wanted to be that person. I wanted to be the comfort and the smiling face to help somebody get through a terrible time.
That's great, thank you. I know that we have some nursing students in our audience today. Is there anything that you'd like to say to them to encourage them? We want to always encourage nurses to do this.
Absolutely, there's 7 of us actually right now at Rutland Regional. It's not for everybody. I would encourage you to dive deeper into what it is, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk to you after. It's rewarding, but it really, I don't want to say rewarding, but you know, and there are some that you'll take home and you'll think, wow, you know, that person was very strong. But I think it's a responsibility that's huge in the nursing field, and technically it's in the scope of practice for the nurses in the emergency room to do it, but we have 7 of us specifically trained to do it, and they're more comfortable calling us on a weekend or something and having us come in, which is totally fine. I don't mind doing that.
Thank you. Amber.
So this is a very cliche answer, but if you talk to a lot of people who end up in law enforcement, they always say they wanted to do it since they were little kids. So that's where I started. I wanted to be Olivia Benson from Law & Order SVU. So when I graduated college, I was hired by the Rutland City Police Department, and I quite literally did everything in my power to end up working for Rutland Unit for Special Investigations, or the Child First Advocacy Center, CFAC. So that's kind of how I started, and then I ended up reaching out. I think Rose Kennedy was the state's attorney at the time, to the state's attorney's office, because I've also have a passion for domestic violence. And I wanted to be the domestic violence investigator, because in my work, 9 times out of 10 when working with adults, domestic violence and sexual violence, they go hand in hand. So I found it was a lot easier for me to work the dual ends of that rather than just working and focusing on one end of it. And I have a passion for working with child victims as well. So the Child First Advocacy Center was the best place for me to be.
Great, thank you. And Jess.
So prior to this role, I was a home visitor for many years, and I never really anticipated ending up with doing domestic and sexual violence work, but I found that of all the families that I interacted with, the cases that I found to be the most horrifying or scary or impactful on me were the ones where I believed that domestic or sexual violence might be a factor. I knew nothing other than I didn't want to make it worse. That was my big focus, and I learned that it's underreported, and I really wanted to learn more about how to impact those families. And so I gave it a try, and hook, line, and sinker. It's the hardest work I have ever done, hands down. But I feel privileged to do this work. It's eye-opening to sit with a victim and to realize that they literally have no supports. I have bad days and I think, man, it's rough. But I never ever feel like I don't have somebody that I could call in those moments. I'm fortunate in that way. And so to have that connection with victims and kind of like what you said, to be that person for them, and not to know everything. We really trust in the work that we do at NewStory that the victim knows their situation best. I know patterns, I know what I see, I can speak from experiences. But at the end of the day, if I'm saying something to someone and they're like, this is not gonna fit in my situation, I trust that, I want that feedback. We interact with folks that really want us to tell them, like, do A, B, and C, and you will find a life free of violence. It's not that simple, and we don't tell people what to do or where to go. I think of myself as somebody that holds a torch. Our advocates hold a torch for the folks that we work with, and we make the best connections with these folks that we can and other folks in our community. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Jess. That is actually the perfect segue into the next question. And talking about the partnership and how we work for these folks, with these folks, can you talk a little bit about NewStory's role in a sexual assault and then how we partner? And I'll ask everyone else about what your partnerships look like.
Yeah. So when a sexual assault arrives at the hospital, we get a phone call to our crisis line. We go up. To be with the client, we're really there to be the advocate for the client and really nothing else. It's very directed by making sure they know their rights, that decisions are being made by them. All lovely folks here, but we want to make sure that the client, is reporting or not reporting based off their own decision, not because, this is terrifying, and we want justice for them. And so we're really there to make sure that their needs are met, that they're comfortable. It is an average of 6 hours, so sometimes just having somebody sitting in the room with you, they might say, I'm not going to talk to you, but you can stay, and then we end up having a 5-hour conversation about all things, just to make them more comfortable and get through that. We work closely with the high-risk team, which Amber sits on and Ian sits on, so that we can really help manage expectations of like the criminal piece of that, because it's not like it happens on TV, and so I'm not sure if that answers all of what.
No, it does. It does. And so from the nursing perspective, you obviously have, Heather, you have a specific job to do when you come into the room for a sexual assault. And what does it look like for you to have an advocate in the room or have law enforcement, because there are sometimes I know that victims are brought into the emergency room by law enforcement. Some self-report, some come in with law enforcement. But how does that impact what you do with the victim?
I do the exam the same way,
Yeah.
whether it's reported or unreported. It's nice to have the support of NewStory in the room with us. That person's scared, and the first time I did an exam, I was scared. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of, I gather material, whether it's bodily fluids or, clothing, that kind of stuff. And then it all gets, we have a chain of custody. It stays with me the whole time. I can't leave the room until everything is sealed with our special tape. And then it goes to security that they sign off, and then whatever district police department signs off and comes and gets it, and then it goes right to the state lab. So there's a lot of steps, but having the support and knowing that that person's being supported while I'm trying to, get the evidence and things like that. Also, I've had experience where whether you or Bianca were in the room with me, and just having a casual conversation with one of you and the victim, I've picked up a lot of stuff that I didn't have to go back and re-ask, so I can write down notes. So it's a great help to have you guys with us.
Oh, that's a great point. People often have to tell their stories many times.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that, Amber, from your perspective? And you work with young people as well,
Yes.
and children,
Yes.
Which is not something that NewStory does. We are certainly there to support and can support the families, but maybe a little bit, because that is a different perspective. But what partnership looks like to you in instances of sexual assault?
So I couldn't do my job without the support of everybody that works in this field in our community. So usually when it comes to juvenile cases, we end up getting our reports through the Department for Children and Families, DCF. And since I work with the Child First Advocacy Center, we're all co-located. So there's a DCF worker who works directly with me, and we collaborate on a majority of our cases. And actually, if we know that a case is going to end up definitively going to prosecution, we end up getting the state's attorney's office involved pretty early on. And then 9 times out of 10, they're have already gone to the hospital and received a SANE, or they've been at our office and we refer them. But for law enforcement, we are there pretty much every step of the way once we become aware of a crime. And I know personally for me, I stay with the case usually through prosecution, and I'm always calling the state's attorney's office and seeing what's happening with the case, and obviously I'm involved with the court process. So
Great. So Ian, how do you do what you do?
I think it's worth talking a little bit about how cases initially come to law enforcement's attention. We're always super grateful when there has been a SANE exam, but that really involves somebody making the decision to report or at least go to the hospital early on, immediately after or shortly after an assault has happened. That can be really confusing for folks, especially when we're talking about an acquaintance sexual assault, a date that has gone the wrong way, away from consent. People might have very complicated feelings about whether they're going to report or not. And I think it's very important for people to know that because they go to the hospital, because they participate in a SANE exam, doesn't mean they are locked into one path going forward. A SANE exam can be confidential, and the person can decide whether or not they want to report to law enforcement. If the SANE exam isn't done, that evidence won't be available to us. So participating in a SANE exam can preserve evidence, but doesn't necessarily give away autonomy and the ability to make decisions about what happens going forward for a victim of sexual assault. Having said that, the other way cases come to our attention is when people report sometimes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes years after the fact. Those reports that happen later in time, there is still a process where we investigate, where we work with witnesses to try to gather as much evidence as we can. And ultimately, once that investigative process is done by Detective Houle or another police officer, it's referred to the state's attorney's office for review and for a prosecution decision. Certainly, we want to pursue sexual assaults as vigorously as we can throughout the court system, but we have to be mindful of what our burden is, which is to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. So that can be a complex decision, and it can also involve conversations with a victim about what the process of a criminal prosecution will look like for them, because I don't think it's fair to people to give them unrealistic views of what's going to happen in the process and what it might mean for them individually. So we'll ultimately, we've got one client, it's the state of Vermont. They've got one directive for us, which is to do the right thing to the best of our ability. We're responsible to that client, but the person most directly and most deeply impacted by a sexual assault is the victim. So I think we owe it to them to have those types of conversations before we jump into a criminal prosecution, at least when it's possible. Sometimes these things happen overnight and people don't want to talk to us. And I respect that, and we'll be able to make decisions without that conversation too.
Sometimes people don't want to talk to us either.
Yep.
So that's okay. That's
totally okay.
I think that's a theme that I've heard from everyone on the panel, that it is up to the individual, and we letting that person drive the train. We say that a lot at the office, but they are the drivers of the train, and it's very important that something can happen on someone's own timeline with realistic expectations being explained to them. Yeah, it is complex. It is very complex. Jess, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I did, because I very much appreciate that perspective from Ian, because a lot of what we do besides, directly emotionally supporting the victim through that exam is managing that expectation, because it is not what people think. Of the cases that are reported, it's a very small percentage, I think less than 1%, that go to prosecution and end up in a conviction. And so you've got someone in the most vulnerable moment of their life. It's horrifying. It'll be with them forever. They're going to do lots of hard work to deal with that trauma, to put their life back together, and then a year and a half later, they're going to be up for court, and being called to court to do that process that's been going on behind the scenes. But in a lot of respects, they've gotten themselves, buttoned back up the way that they're comfortable or to function, and they're moving on, and they're getting their life back to some degree, and then boom, we're back here in this prosecution, and it is very re-victimizing. And so managing those expectations and not just going in for that, that conviction is really important to me on behalf of the victims.
Yeah,
So.
and if I can tag on to the end of
Absolutely.
that. I think a lot of times when people talk about the criminal justice system and the work we're doing, you hear about plea bargains or people cutting a deal. That does happen. Not every single case goes to trial. And one of the things we try to take into account when we are talking about which cases go to trial, which cases we are offering plea bargains in, is a victim-centered approach. We try to make our most lenient offers before the victim has had to go through the process of testifying at a deposition or testifying at trial, because we know that can be re-traumatizing. But that is an open conversation between the prosecutor, the victim's advocates that work in our office, and the victim, because some people find the process of testifying at trial, really affirming, giving them back some of the control of their life, being able to tell their story in court. Other folks find that process very daunting, and we don't want a criminal prosecution to compound the harm that a victim of sexual assault has experienced. So in my mind, a victim-centered prosecution takes that into account when making offers to resolve a case or making the decision to go forward with a trial.
I'm certain that I'm the oldest one on the panel, and I can say that things look a lot different now than they looked when I started this work. And I'm wondering what each of you might say to someone either that has experienced sexual assault and maybe hasn't said anything about it, or our community about sexual assault, because we always want people to know. We're all prospective jurors, right? We always want people to know things don't look like they look when Olivia Benson wraps up a case in 1 hour episode
With commercial breaks.
With commercial breaks, and it's all done. And we tie a neat bow on it, and it's done. But I'm wondering what you would want our community to know, or someone who has experienced a sexual assault but maybe hasn't said anything. So I don't know who would like to take that one first.
I'll go first.
Okay.
If you have experienced a situation that makes you uncomfortable, don't fall victim to comparative suffering. Your experience is real. And if you have questions about an experience, NewStory is here to support you. You could call our hotline number 24/7, 7 days a week. And you don't have to give your name. You could just say, if someone I know is in this situation, what would you suggest? Or what would you say? Like Ava said, if you interact with NewStory, all services are voluntary. You can come and go as you please. You could come and have one conversation, decide you never want to talk about it again, and we will not report anything beyond our walls. Or we could, work over a long period of time to help you get things together. But there are supports, and there are people that want to support you. So if you have questions and you're not sure, even reach out to us.
So you can always contact a police department in your area. So if you live in Rutland City Police Department, or you can contact for the Vermont State Police. I know at the Child First Advocacy Center we do have embedded victim advocates. So you can always contact the CFAC is what we call it. It's an acronym. And they can speak with you, and I'm there a majority of the time. There's also an embedded Vermont State Police detective that's there, so we can answer any questions that you might have. I think it's important to note that police don't have an obligation to bring cases to the prosecution if a victim does not want that. So I'm very victim-centered in the way that I approach my own cases. Usually what ends up happening is I do an interview with victims or survivors. Either it's a juvenile or an adult. In this case, I'm going to talk about an adult because juveniles are actually bound by what their parents want. So when I'm speaking with an adult, whether it be domestic violence or sexual violence, I always have a conversation with them prior to going in the interview room, and I ask them what they would like to have happen, what their expectations are going forward in this process, because I don't want them to be uncomfortable. I don't want to ask them something that's going to set them over the edge and make them completely not want to go forward with this process. So I'm very aware of what my role is in this, but they need to know that they are driving the train, or this is their life that we are taking. I'm taking their life into my hands, and I need to be cognizant of what I'm going to do going forth. So I think that that's really important to know.
Can you talk a little bit about what it would look like from a parent perspective if their child has experienced sexual violence, and just a little bit about what that process looks like?
Yes, so we get our cases for juveniles, I said this before, through the Department of Children and Families. We can also get them through healthcare providers, we can get them through teachers, or the parents themselves. When it comes to that, either we get an intake through the Department of Children and Families, or we can get a call from parents themselves to the Child Advocacy Center, or the parents can go directly to a police department and it will get referred to the Child Advocacy Center. Since we are all co-located, juveniles cases get investigated by a DCF worker, and they also get investigated by law enforcement. And we will usually bring in the parents and the juvenile together, and we'll have a conversation. Depending on the age of the juvenile, it really does impact what we end up doing. If it's a younger child, we end up having that conversation kind of more towards closed doors, so they're aware of what's going to happen going forward, what they would like to see going forward. It's the same with the adults. It's driven by them. They are the ones who get to make that decision and that choice ultimately. When it's an older child, so either a juvenile or a teenager, I try to be more cognizant that they're approaching adulthood. They know what's happened to them. They know what's going on. So having a conversation with their parents, with them not there, or speaking in code words isn't going to work, because they know what's happening, and it's not fair to exclude them from that process. But it's also important to note that parents do, until you turn 18 years old, get to make that ultimate decision. And I encourage parents, if their child is of age, to have this conversation and kind of talk with it through them, to have those conversations about what the child would like and the parents would like, and me in the middle, or decide from there.
Great, thank you, thank you. Heather, what would you want to say?
Mine is a little bit different. I am not gathering information to prosecute or anything like that. I'm just getting forensic evidence. It's important to know that you have up to 5 days after an assault that we can swab either, your body, or it's very important, if you still have the clothes that you were wearing, you bring them with you. Unfortunately, you don't get the clothes back, and that's upsetting to some people. But some people are like, well, I don't want it anyways because it's going to remind me of that. So you have that piece of it. Our exams, like I said, we don't interview to prosecute. We just collect the evidence, and we're there to support the victim, give them the resources. We can offer to do blood work for them. We can also swab for STIs. We can check for HIV. Obviously, if it just happened, they aren't going to test positive for HIV, but we're going to get a baseline for them. So it's just important that people know that if you're on a date or you're with a friend, when you say no, it's no. And I have a teenage daughter that I keep telling, when you say no, it stops. And if it doesn't, there's a problem. So I think that's really important that people need to know.
That's great, thank you.
So I'm going to talk about two things.
Okay.
Right, attorneys always talk more than they're supposed to. The first is more broadly, right, people here are citizens of a democracy, and they play a role in how their government allocates resources. I don't think it's a secret to anyone who's following the news that both in Vermont and nationally, there is a law enforcement officer shortage that extends to prosecutors' offices. And in an environment of scarcity, governments are making decisions about how they allocate resources, what types of investigations they prioritize. The model that happens at a special investigation unit in Vermont requires collaboration among different government entities who are responsible to different voter bases. Having dedicated, well-trained, experienced police officers like Detective Houle assigned to work those cases, from my perspective, is crucial. It's foundational to successful prosecutions of these heinous crimes. But government agencies are making decisions about whether they put the limited number of police officers they have on patrol investigating retail thefts, whether they're doing high visibility traffic work, whether they're trying to push folks into trainings and spots for detective work, investigation of sexual assaults. Those are decisions that are being made in town halls and in state houses across this country. If these are investigations and prosecutions that matter to you, let your town reps know, let your state reps know, because they're making these decisions. Separate from that, I'll piggyback on something that Heather just said, which is that sexual assault covers a broad range of activities. And I think for those of us who grew up watching Law and Order Special Investigation Unit, there is a tendency to believe that it falls into this like really heinous category of like people jumping out of bushes and grabbing people or pulling them into vans. That is absolutely a sexual assault, but there's a wide range of other activities that are also sexual assaults under Vermont law. I think one of the formulations of what that means is that no means no. Another way of thinking about that for all of us is that only yes means yes. Only yes means yes. Shy of that, there is a real risk that people are engaging in sexual behaviors without consent, and under Vermont law, that is a sexual assault. So that is a cultural norm that I think all of us, as prospective jurors, as people who are trying to take care of themselves and others, should internalize, that only yes means yes. So those are the two things I wanted to say.
Well, thank you for saying that. That is our next News Story.
That's my new tagline.
Shirt. It's a bumper. Only yes means yes. That is the way to say this. So we've got time. I would love to hear from our audience and give them the opportunity to ask some questions if they've got them. I believe that there's a mic back there. So this is your opportunity to ask questions of these amazing folks up here.
Yeah, I just have a question for Heather, I believe it is. How long did it take you to get certified to do the same and the same P?
So they do 2 sessions. We go to Montpelier. We do a lot of it online. A lot of the training, I think it was like 8 hours online work, and then we did 3 days in person. One of the days being we actually went to UVM. We got to perform the exam on a live person, which was neat because they could tell us, what we weren't doing right, if they were uncomfortable, if something we said, like it was a whole scenario that we went into. So that was great. That was great feedback as well. I think for the nursing students, the biggest thing people are like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to be called to court for any of this. The nurses that I've worked with, I think they've only been called to court maybe once or twice. So that shouldn't be a reason to not become certified as a SANE nurse. But then the pediatric the pediatric was a separate week that we did. But it's the same thing. We did online work and then we did the 3 days in person. And then we have ongoing training. I just came back from a training from Dartmouth yesterday. It was a 2-day training, very informative. That was about child abuse and domestic abuse. Next week, we're going up to Burlington, and our Vermont coordinators are putting together like a sim lab for pediatric SANE. So we have a lot of ongoing training.
Are there other questions?
I actually have, hello, my name's Angie. I have 2 questions for you guys. One of them, you hear a lot about in the news. How long do you have to report a sexual assault? Is there a time limit to this, or is that just bogus?
So in terms of a SANE exam or in terms of prosecution?
Prosecution, yes.
So, speaking for Vermont, the statute of limitations is when we have to file a case. Part of the answer to this question depends on when the sexual assault occurred, because the statute of limitations has extended and extended and extended. Let us worry about that. let us worry about that. People should report. If it turns out that we are by law barred from prosecuting a case, that's okay. It is far better that someone reports and connects with the resources through the Special Investigation Unit than they worry about when this happened and whether I can prosecute it or not. My advice to folks is to report it. Let us sort out the details of whether we can file.
Thank you. My second question was, in a situation where you are you say no, okay? What are the steps after that? Because not many people talk about that. You say no, you don't just poof to the other room or to a safe zone. What would you tell children or students? Like, what would be your next step after that?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure, yeah.
Are you meaning if the sexual activity doesn't stop when you say no, what are the next steps? Or what are just the next steps when you've said no?
What are the next steps if it continues?
If it continues.
Yes.
Safety, I would say, I'll first say, from our perspective at NewStory, safety is number one. And the person in the situation always knows their situation best. So there's not one answer there that is the right answer. It's going to depend on the situation. And so I would say if you can safely remove yourself from that situation, then do so as quickly as possible with, whether you are partially clothed or not. We worry, we get hung up on all that stuff, right? We get hung up on someone might see me without my top on, or someone might see me and what are they going to think? Get yourself safe, whatever that means. That isn't always possible if you're with an aggressor that is violent or going to be violent. And so I think that someone just has to recognize what their situation is, what they have to do to keep themselves safe in the moment, and whatever it is that they have to do to keep themselves safe in the moment is not something to be ashamed of, and it's not something to apologize for, and it is not a reason not to report afterwards. So if the sexual activity continues until they can be safe, even after they've said no, reporting it, they aren't at fault. They've done nothing wrong. And they have said no, and that is what they needed to do. And everything else they do beyond that point to keep themselves safe is exactly what they need to do.
Thank you very much.
And if I can piggyback on that, I think one of the reasons that sexual assaults are so underreported is that people start talking to themselves about, well, no one will believe me, or no one will take this seriously, or I didn't immediately run, or I didn't. Okay. Get to the place where a report happens. Let us worry about that. The human experience is so much broader than one type of sexual assault. And unless we as a society are able to internalize that and respond to it, these problems are going to keep occurring. So we need to respond to the broad experience of what sexual assault actually is in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Jess, I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question to her question. So the question was, what is the time limit on reporting? And I'm going to take this from a victim advocacy perspective, from our agency's perspective. What's the time limit on reporting to NewStory for a sexual assault?
Well, we don't have one. So we'll work with someone anywhere in their experience. So whether it has happened, 2 days ago, 5 weeks ago, or 50 years ago, we are here to talk to you and to support you and to help you make informed decisions. I also just wanted to comment on your question. So certainly there's situations where where a victim has no indicators that, something's out of order before that moment. That absolutely happens. I think I just want to reiterate that the large majority of the folks that we interact with, right, know their abuser really well. It is not always an aggressive assault like that. It can be very coercive. It can be very manipulative. It also, you know, we've all mentioned that it's underreported, but I don't think we ever really dove into why that is. If the person that is supposed to love you, respect you, and keep you safe is the person hurting you, whether that's your parent, your roommate, your partner, it's not okay. And I think we work really hard on the awareness and prevention piece too of, you know, we go into schools and we talk with kids, and we would support parents in talking with their kids around boundaries, around red flags that happen way sooner than that moment. So for me, and again, every situation is different, but one of the very early red flags that I encourage people to look for, just in my experience doing this for almost 7 years, is the difference between words and actions. So whether you've been with someone for 2 days, 2 weeks, or 20 years, if their words and their actions are not consistent, that, you know, I would take a look at that. I would be concerned and maybe just seek some support. And that doesn't mean if you reach out to us that you have to leave that relationship either. You know, you could reach out and say, hey, this is sort of the norm, you know, in our situation. Like, how do I shift away from this? You know, unfortunately, kids are exposed to media in a way different way and sexual content at a very early age. And parents, you know, lots of parents are at work that you might have been home before. And so really spending time with your kids and working on that like healthy relationship boundary work early, way earlier than most parents are comfortable. They say 8 actually is the age at which you should start talking with your children, or they're hearing it elsewhere. Right. So
I would say to build on that too, that body autonomy is so important, and working with our children as young as we possibly can about understanding their own bodily autonomy and being able to, as they start to become aware of themselves as sexual beings, and to understand how to ask for what they want, know what they want, and say no when something isn't comfortable. Don't be afraid of alienating that potential boyfriend or girlfriend or partner. Knowing your own body to the point, your own body and your own mind to be able to say no and feel comfortable to say no from a young age about anything. Yeah.
I'd also like to piggyback on that. One of the first questions when we're doing a pediatric exam, what do you call your body parts? And they gave us a good example yesterday in the training we were in. A family called the child's genitalia her purse. So when she was saying that something was happening to her purse, they thought it was like her little pocketbook that she would carry. So that, you know, talking to your children at a young age.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was
so
debating on whether I was going to bring up. I had an experience with a child once that they were trying to tell people that someone was touching their cookie, and it didn't get recognized in the way that it needed to, because you know, sometimes we're uncomfortable, I think, with young children using proper terminology, but it's so important for them to be able to communicate what they're experiencing in a way that they can get support. So.
And I just wanted to add to that. So it's really important when, as a law enforcement officer, so when we are interviewing juveniles from any age, we are not allowed to assume anything. It's called a forensic interview. So actually, we cannot ask them what they call their body parts. They need to tell us that, and then we need to kind of bounce around and figure out what they're actually talking about, and it makes it significantly harder for us when we're doing a forensic interview when they're not speaking of a body part that is actually known to us and known to the general population to be that body part. And we can always ask the parents in a separate interview what their child calls that body part, but it's extremely difficult. And Ian, you've seen forensic interviews. It's difficult when children don't know what to actually call that, or they might feel uncomfortable because it's not socially acceptable for them to start talking about their own body parts. So it's important for parents to start that awareness early on.
Great. Thank you all. That's so important. Any other questions?
Hi. In the instances with the juveniles, if the parents don't want to prosecute, is there any way to bypass that?
So, can you give me what age of a juvenile are we talking about? Because there's a lot of that goes into that, and there's a lot of conversations that happen before that decision is actually made.
I guess a teen.
Okay.
You know, if the perpetrator were like a family member or a family friend and the parents didn't, I think you said that it's up to the parents at the end of.
Yeah, so legally, since a juvenile is under the age of 18, they can't make those decisions, and a parent needs to step in. But I would encourage, when a parent is not necessarily on board, but a juvenile is, I would encourage them to have those conversations. And we have a lot of conversations at the Child Advocacy Center about this with advocates. So it's not necessarily, if a parent was coming to me and their child is adamant that they want to do this, I would sit down with all of them and we would kind of have a conversation about steps moving forward. And it doesn't mean that that door is closed as soon as they leave. That's a conversation that can continue when they go home and can continue for months down the line. So say a juvenile is 16 and their parents are kind of wishy-washy and they leave, and then 5 months down the line they're calling us and saying, we want to do this, we can do that. It's not closed. And we involve a lot of advocacy work. Mental health services are also involved when it comes to that, and we also, not only mental health services for the victim or the juvenile, but also the family as a whole. We have, we call it MDT, it's a multidisciplinary team, and we meet each month and we go over these cases. So that includes mental health, it includes Rutland Regional Medical Center, the State's Attorney's Office, and our advocates and our law enforcement, and we really dive into these cases to try and figure out what we're going to do going forward and what would be best for the family and the victim.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, every prosecution is the government of the state of Vermont versus the perpetrator, not the victim or the victim's parents. So while we, at least speaking for my office, while we do try to be victim-centered, there are instances where a perpetrator's parents are trying to protect a family member, and we may have to go a different way from the guardian of a juvenile's wishes. We might have to forge forward with a prosecution to keep both that individual child safe and their other potential victims.
I didn't hear your question correctly, because I think were you specifically asking a case with like a family member?
Or just, if the parents didn't want to move forward with the prosecution, is there any way that, especially for like particularly
Yes.
Yes,
so there definitely are circumstances when that happens. I was taking that, there's a very broad spectrum of these cases, and I was taking it a different route, and Ian's absolutely right. There are definitely cases when parents are not on board, and we need to make a determination what is safe for the victim, and then we go from there.
Both answers are great. Yeah.
And if I can follow up on the family member or trusted family friend, perpetrator type scenario, I think for a lot of parents and caregivers, they want to believe that the people they love and that they trust in their lives also care for and love their children the way we would all expect to do that safely. So there is, for some parents, a built-in, I don't want to say disbelief, but they don't want to believe that anything bad is happening to their child, and certainly they don't want to believe anything bad is happening coming from a person they love or trust. And that's a hard thing to fight against, but for those of us who are responsible for children, whether they're our own children or people that we're trusted, that people trust us to take care of children for a short time, whatever we feel about adults, other adults, that has to come second to the safety of children. So if people are getting, somebody talking about a purse or a cookie or however else a child might refer to their genitalia, our first instinct should be to believe children and to try to keep them safe. Once an investigation plays out, we can take it from there. If it turns out that nothing bad was happening, that's okay. But if something bad is happening and an adult, because they don't want to believe something bad is happening, doesn't report, the harm to that child can be compounded over weeks and months and years. And that is a nightmare scenario.
Jess, did you have a
Well, I was
follow-up?
just going to say, I think it's shame. There's a large amount of shame for most victims, and then shame, like if I made the decision to leave my child with that person. So I very much agree with that.
Yeah,
And I-
this seems most pronounced when it is
Family member.
the adult's romantic partner, right? A husband and wife scenario. People don't want to believe their spouse is capable of that, or even their ex-spouse is capable of that. And that is a hard human instinct to fight against, but right, these are children, right? Like they're children that we have to protect.
I do want to just mention, so while we do have victims that certainly want their abuser prosecuted, and we support them fully in that, and we have great partnerships, prosecution isn't the answer for every victim that we work with, and so sometimes it's kind of the unpopular, social perspective of really doing what is best for the victim. And so, the victims advocates at NewStory, we are confidential, and so anything that you say to us is confidential, with the exception of we are mandated reporters. But we work for the victim. Whereas the victims advocates, which are excellent over at Ian's shop, they work for the state of Vermont. And so they are very supportive and they're great, and we use them, all the time. In supporting our victims, they do have an obligation to sort of keep the prosecution moving and functioning, and to keep those victims on board to some degree when they're moving through that process. So the information that's shared with them is a little bit different than the information when it's shared with us. And so we try really hard to partner in a way that's effective for the victims and for our needs, but just knowing the difference. And knowing, so like sometimes that means coming to us first to sort of process through how to go about those steps. Once the prosecution has begun, it is very difficult. If a victim doesn't want to proceed, it's, as Ian said, it is between the state and the defendant. And so just the impacts of that, so being aware of that process.
Thank you. Other questions?
How would you suggest that we best support a victim who's not yet ready to report, but has disclosed, but is not ready to take the next?
I'll listen to them, believe them, and be there for them is what is the first thing I would say. Having a friend or a family member that is willing to hear you, and I know we care deeply about the people in our lives, and we want them to be safe and we want them to be secure, and sometimes our first instinct is to say, we've got to call the police, we've got to call NewStory, we've got to call someone, we've got to report this, we've got to do this thing. And what they're not actually needing advice at that moment. They're needing someone to hear them. They're doing a test run. They want to see what your reaction is going to be. They want to hear it, and then in a gentle way, getting them forward to talk to other supportive help is one of the things I would say. But I've also, heard our panelists. I know if we're talking about someone who has experienced a sexual assault and it happened last night, and they think they might want to report. Now is the time to go and get a kit, or now is potentially the time to talk to law enforcement. But we can help, you can help as a support, as a family member, as someone in the community. You can help them ease into that process. There are a lot of us that are willing to sort of walk through that with them.
I would say to both the support person and the victim, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Everyone wants it over and done with and behind them yesterday. It doesn't work that way, and so taking as good of care of yourself as the victim, but also as the support person, because compassion fatigue is real, and what they're experiencing emotionally is not going to be linear. It is not going to make sense at times to them or to you. There'll be a large amount of them blaming themselves in some manner, and so really, listening. If you don't know what to say, don't say anything, but it is never the victim's fault. So if you can reiterate that to them, that's great. But really just, it's going to take time. It's going to take more time than they want. If it happens within the last 5 days, certainly making it to the hospital to get that kit while you think and process and make next step plans, that can go on a shelf and sit there and never be touched again. Like you literally can go in, do the exam, which is uncomfortable, and not think about what you're doing next. You just simply say, I don't want to report it at this time. And it can literally sit on a shelf for the day that you want to come back to that. I know we've said that many times, but if really, truly, when Ian says we can't go back and get that evidence, you may feel very differently when you're 2 years out from the experience and you're safe from that person in a different way, whether you're on a college campus, or what have you. But we can do lots and lots of processing at whatever pace the victim needs, but the kit can sit there if it's collected. So,
On that note, when somebody does come in and they don't, well, whether they report it or don't report it, they get the kit number. We give them the kit number, and the number to call if they do want to report it. They don't get a phone call saying, okay, we've processed your kit. People want to know that. Do I know, when they process it and stuff like that, but they don't do that. But anybody that comes in has a kit done will get a number.
So I could call that number in theory and say I want to report and not even speak to you locally, or you know what I mean? Like if I'm concerned about who I am in the community and I decide to report, I wouldn't even have to tell hospital staff, right? I would just be able to call that number. And is that how it works? Or would that be too?
So if you decided in the like a year down the road
Right.
you wanted to, yes, there is a number that you could call,
Okay.
and then you have the kit number as well.
Awesome. So.
I have a question about legalities. So we know that these rape kits and a lot of things, like because of not enough people in law enforcement or whatever it is. But from my layman's experience, it seems like when they are prosecuted, they're not getting very much time. And they've totally affected this child, person, human life for the rest of their life, yet it seems like the maximum sentences are like 5 years. I mean, I don't really know exactly what it is, but it seems like you hear stuff on the news and you're like, oh, they got 5 years, whoop-de-doo. The kid's gonna be 15, 20 years old, but then they have to still deal with that for the rest of their life, and maybe even having to interact with this person for the rest of their life.
Sure. So, I think that's me.
Yeah.
I'll back up and say that sexual violence can be charged in a number of different ways depending on how old the child was, whether the sexual violence happened once or more than once, and the nature of the sexual violence. Certainly, a sexual assault, almost all sexual assaults have a potential maximum sentence of life imprisonment. That's a potential maximum sentence. Vermont does not have sentencing guidelines like sometimes you hear about in federal prosecutions for drugs or guns. That means that upon conviction after a jury trial, a judge could impose, the judge decides what the ultimate sentence will be in that scenario where there's been a trial and a conviction. The judge could pick anywhere in the range of minimum sentences between 0, potentially in some, depending on how it's charged, and something less than life up to life. That means there's a lot of uncertainty in what will happen even if we go through a trial. And in deciding to go to trial, especially when we're talking about child victims, that is a weighty, weighty decision. If we're going to ask a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old to get up on the stand and confront their abuser across a courtroom, there's a lot that goes into that for the child, for the process. And no matter how much we believe in a case, we cannot guarantee that a jury will convict. We can't guarantee that a child will get through that process okay. So if a child or their parent, trusted parent is telling us this will be incredibly traumatic for the child, we don't want to compound the harm that's already happened. So we may offer a plea agreement that gains certainty. We know there will be a conviction. We know there will be accountability, supervision, and that avoids a trial. And to do that, a more lenient sentence can be the incentive to do that. So when you read about or see on the news that there has been a reduced or more lenient sentence in a case like this, frequently that is the product of concerns for the victim, concerns for achieving certainty and accountability, rather than being dismissive of the victim's experience. Quite to the contrary, it's usually coming from a place of deep concern for the victim's experience.
I would also say to that is that prosecutions and convictions are wonderful, and we like to see that judicial accountability, consequences for actions, and but for the victim, survivor, that is only one piece of the healing, and it may not be healing for everyone. As Ian was just saying, it can be quite traumatic to take the stand, to go through the process, the investigation process, to relive that experience. It can be quite traumatic for the victim, but for many, that isn't the end piece for the survivor. There's a lot of work toward healing that has to go beyond that. And I think that's one of the things that Hollywood teaches us, is that neat bow at the end, where there's been a conviction and all's right with the rainbow comes out and all's right with the world. And for survivors, that isn't always the case. And so there's much work that they have to do to heal. Their sentence is a lot longer often than the perpetrators, and so it is one piece of the puzzle for that survivor and for them being healthy again.
I also think there's this idea that once someone is incarcerated, that the victim is free of their violence. And that isn't always the case. We work with a large number of victims whose abusers are currently incarcerated, which is a good thing that they're incarcerated, but the work for the victim still continues. And in a lot of ways, the abuse still continues from the system, and them reaching out. So it is, prosecution, we love when that works out, and that's what the victim wants. And it is not for everyone in every case, and it can be frustrating, certainly as those support people. So again, taking care of yourself, you can call our hotline and get some support around how to support the person in your life, because these things are super complex, or we would have put ourselves out of business by now, all of us. So.
Any other questions? Well, I appreciate you all very much. I appreciate the audience. I appreciate your questions, you being here to hear about this. Our audience that is watching this, it's not an easy topic, and we say often we get more back than we give, and I believe that completely. It is incredibly rewarding to support people and have them know that there is good in the world, that there is an entire community of people that is here to support them, and we are grateful to be a part of that process for them. I would love to give you all an opportunity if there's anything you didn't get to say that you would like to say, and thank you so much for your partnership and for being here this morning.
I'll go back to something I said before, which is if people feel like they had a sexual encounter that just wasn't quite right, please consider reporting it. I know there's a lot that's wrapped into an acquaintance sexual assault, but if these things aren't reported, we can't begin doing the work of changing the cultural narrative around those sexual assaults.
Thank you.
The hospital is open 24/7. We're there 365 days a week, Like I said, we have 7 SANE nurses that are pediatric and adult certified. Come in. You know, you have 5 days for us to collect evidence, but even if you just want to come in and, you know, we can help you report it to a police officer, or we can give you the resources to NewStory or the Child Advocacy Center.
I'm going to piggyback off of that. The police are always open. We're always there. But I think, kind of on a different note, if you have a passion for this and you would like to work in this field, please do it. There's not enough of us. And if you have a passion to do it, then you can make an impact greater than you will ever know. So.
Any last words? No? Okay. Thank you all so much. And we'll leave with only yes means yes.